The champagne flute remained empty in front of Jamal Carter, while the flight attendants served every other passenger in first class with mechanical ease. No one on board would have guessed that a single phone call from him would ground the entire crew within 5 minutes and force the airline to re-evaluate its internal culture from the top down. Jamal, a 45-year-old African-American CEO of CarterTech, an industry leader in data security, was flying from Seattle to New York to speak at the National Leadership Forum. Clad in a tailored grey suit and carrying himself with quiet authority, Jamal was used to being underestimated, especially in spaces where faces like his were rare. But what the crew failed to realize was that behind his calm demeanor was a man who had spent decades navigating rooms built to exclude him, and who knew exactly how to respond when dignity was denied. Jamal stepped onto the aircraft with the quiet confidence of someone who'd long mastered the art of being underestimated. His first-class boarding pass had cleared him through the gate without issue, but not without the wary glance from the gate agent. A subtle pause, a flicker of surprise, then the forced smile. It was a look Jamal knew well, one that questioned how he belonged in a space like this. He made his way down the jet bridge and into the cabin, nodding politely as he located seat 1A by the window. He placed his carry-on in the overhead bin with practiced ease and slid into the leather seat, retrieving his laptop almost immediately. With the ease of repetition, he opened a folder labeled NYC Keynote, Leadership and Systems, scrolling through the final revisions he planned to review before landing. The cabin filled gradually, a steady stream of tailored suits and leather briefcases, most of them worn by white men in their 40s and 50s. A few white women followed, mostly executive assistants or consultants by the look of them. Jamal's presence, his deep brown skin, tightly trimmed beard, and natural fade, was the visual anomaly in the room. Yet he didn't shrink. He never did. Years of corporate warfare had taught him to sit comfortably in discomfort. As the last of the passengers filed in, 2 flight attendants began circulating through the aisle. The first, a woman in her early 50s with a tightly pulled bun and a clipped tone of voice, wore a name tag that read Brenda. Her movements were precise, controlled, the kind that came from decades of flying and the authority that came with seniority. She greeted each passenger with rehearsed pleasantries, though her tone never quite warmed. Trailing behind her was a younger attendant named Kayla, no older than her late 20s, clearly newer to the job and still absorbing cues from her senior. Jamal noticed how Kayla seemed more relaxed when Brenda wasn't watching, offering a more genuine smile to passengers. But when Brenda turned to glance her way, Kayla straightened immediately, mirroring the older woman's formality. Jamal returned to his laptop, pretending not to notice, but years in executive leadership had trained him to read subtle dynamics. He could tell who held the real authority and who followed it without question. Brenda was in charge, and Kayla followed. As Jamal sipped from the bottle of water he'd brought from the terminal, he felt the shift in atmosphere that always seemed to follow him in spaces like this. A quiet recalibration of assumptions, a subtle questioning of his presence. He didn't need anyone to make room for him. He'd spent his life carving out space where none had been offered. And on this flight, what seemed like just another business trip would soon become the moment that exposed how deeply inequality still lived in the so-called front rows of America. The pre-departure service began like clockwork, with Brenda and Kayla moving briskly through the first-class cabin, offering passengers their choice of champagne, orange juice, or water. Jamal watched as each traveler around him was greeted with a smile and handed a sparkling glass of champagne in slender flutes. Classic first-class formality. When Brenda reached his row, she didn't make eye contact. Instead, she turned to the passenger in 1B, a white man in a navy suit, and asked, "Champagne or orange juice, sir?" After handing him a flute, she pivoted to the next row without acknowledging Jamal. At first, Jamal gave her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she was distracted. Maybe she'd circle back. But when Kayla passed by moments later with a second tray of drinks and again skipped him, Jamal pressed the service button calmly. Kayla returned with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yes, sir?" "I wasn't offered a pre-departure beverage," Jamal said evenly. Kayla hesitated, then glanced toward the galley where Brenda was preparing another tray. "Oh, we're actually out of champagne, sir," she replied, avoiding his gaze. Jamal's eyes drifted to the galley behind her, where a half-full bottle of champagne sat visible on the counter. He didn't argue. He didn't ask again. Instead, he reached for his phone and opened the Notes app, documenting the time, the exchange, the names on their badges, and the exact words spoken. It wasn't the first time he'd encountered this brand of subtle exclusion. It just had a different uniform this time. As the flight continued boarding, the microaggressions mounted. No hot towel was offered to him, while every other passenger received one with a smile. When meals were served, he was served last, and his entree was lukewarm. At one point, when he requested an extra pillow for back support, Brenda offered a tight smile and said curtly, "First-class service includes one pillow, sir. That's the standard." The words dripped with condescension. Jamal responded with a nod and nothing more, his expression unreadable. But behind his composed exterior, he noted every slight with the precision of someone who had been here before, who had been dismissed and disrespected in boardrooms, lounges, and now, in seat 1A, he logged it all: the absent towel, the late meal, the dismissive tone. Years of leading one of the fastest-growing cybersecurity firms in the country had taught him one rule above all: document everything. So that's what he did. Every refusal, every subtle humiliation, every lie delivered with a smile. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to demand anything. Because Jamal Carter knew exactly how to hold power to account, not with outrage, but with evidence. As the aircraft leveled out at cruising altitude, Jamal continued working in silence, the cabin buzzing with the quiet clatter of laptops, silverware, and hushed conversations. Beside him, the man in 1B, Thomas Green, a 52-year-old investment strategist from Connecticut, leaned slightly in his direction, his voice low and deliberate. "I've been watching," he said without preamble. "What they're doing, it's not just careless, it's deliberate. If you decide to report it, I'll back you up. I'll give a statement." Jamal didn't look up from his screen immediately. He was used to being the only one who noticed, the only one who cared. But Green's offer was calm, unsolicited, and surprisingly sincere. Finally, Jamal glanced over, expression neutral. "Appreciate that," he said, "but I'm not angry. I'm just waiting for the next one." The conversation ended there, but a silent understanding had passed between them. Jamal returned to his notes, his mind already categorizing the encounter like so many before it. But then, as if on cue, it happened. Brenda approached their row again, this time with a tray of beverages. She reached across to hand Green a refill, her movements abrupt, careless. Without so much as a glance toward Jamal, her elbow tipped a water glass on the edge of the tray, sending it spilling across Jamal's tray table and onto his laptop keyboard with a sharp splash. Ice clattered against his notebook and phone. For a split second, silence hung in the air. Then Brenda chuckled, not apologetically, but with something closer to smug dismissal. "Oops," she said, tone mocking. "Accidents happen. Hope you're not too sensitive, sir." Jamal froze, not because he was shocked, he wasn't, but because he now had everything he needed. His laptop was wet, but still functional. He calmly closed the lid and pulled his phone from his jacket pocket. He didn't say a word to Brenda, whose smirk barely wavered before she turned and moved on. Green, now fully alert, muttered under his breath, "That was no accident." Jamal said nothing in return, already tapping out a brief message with precise, practiced fingers. He didn't raise his voice, didn't signal for the flight attendants again. Instead, he opened a secure messaging app, one used internally at CarterTech for board-level communications, and composed a short, direct note to Helen Young, chair of CarterTech and member of the Aerosky Air Board of Directors. The subject line read simply, "Incident, Flight 247. In less than 30 seconds, the message was sent, attaching a summary of his detailed notes and a time-stamped description of every encounter since boarding. No emotion, just facts and power. Jamal leaned back, wiped the table down with a napkin, and pulled his dry backup tablet from his carry-on. Whatever happened next was no longer a matter of possibility. It was inevitable. He wasn't just a passenger who'd been disrespected. He was the wrong man to underestimate. And Brenda, whether she realized it or not, had just crossed the final line. Within minutes of Jamal's message to Helen Young, chair of the board at CarterTech, and a sitting executive on Aerosky Air's corporate oversight committee. The wheels began to turn. Somewhere at 38,000 feet above the Midwest, the balance of power shifted. Brenda was just returning to the galley when her in-flight phone rang sharply. She answered with her usual clipped tone, only to freeze mid-sentence as the voice on the other end gave her direct, unmistakable instructions. Cease all cabin service immediately. You and the rest of the crew on Flight 561 are being placed on temporary suspension pending investigation into allegations of discriminatory behavior. The captain has been informed and will be addressing passengers shortly. Expect a compliance officer to meet the flight upon arrival. Brenda's hand trembled slightly as she lowered the handset, her eyes darting across the cabin in disbelief. Kayla, standing behind her, heard enough to understand. Her face drained of color and she whispered, "Oh my God," before covering her mouth with her hand. She wasn't crying yet, but she was close. Jamal sat quietly in seat 1A, watching the ripple effect play out in real time. There was no need for confrontation, no dramatic speech. The truth had already spoken. The first-class cabin shifted from casual chatter to palpable tension as passengers looked around, sensing something unusual was happening. The man in 1B, Thomas Green, watched in silent awe, his expression a mix of vindication and shock. The crew scrambled to mask their unease, but it was too late. Word traveled fast through small spaces. Kayla glanced at Jamal with wide, glassy eyes, and for a moment he almost felt pity for her. Almost. She had chosen to remain silent. Now the silence would cost her. Brenda, still gripping the galley counter for balance, attempted to compose herself, but the flush creeping up her neck betrayed her. She turned toward Jamal, perhaps to speak, to explain, to offer an apology. Too little, too late, but Jamal raised one hand slightly, palm out. No words, just clarity. His voice, when it came, was quiet, but every nearby passenger heard it. "Next time," he said, locking eyes with her, "serve with respect, not with prejudice." The sentence cut through the air sharper than any raised voice ever could. Brenda faltered, mouth slightly open, but no sound emerged. Jamal turned back toward the window, letting the finality of his words settle over the cabin like a closing verdict. The champagne they had so confidently withheld hours ago suddenly seemed irrelevant. What mattered now wasn't a drink, it was accountability. Jamal didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He simply picked up his tablet and resumed reviewing notes for the leadership summit he was flying to attend. From the outside, he looked like any executive preparing for his next presentation. But inside that cabin, every crew member and every passenger who had witnessed the events unfold now understood exactly who he was. Not just a CEO, not just another black man in first class. He was a mirror, and in him they had seen the truth of their own actions reflected back. Undeniable, undeniable, and unforgettable. In the days following Flight 561, Aerosky Air issued a formal public apology, acknowledging the incident and affirming its commitment to dignity, equity, and the highest standards of service. The airline's CEO, Ronald Blake, personally reached out to Jamal, requesting a private meeting and later inviting him to join a newly formed executive advisory panel on inclusive service excellence. Jamal, measured and intentional as always, declined financial restitution for the ordeal. Instead, he proposed something more enduring, a partnership. His counteroffer was a scholarship and training initiative called First Class for All, a program designed to educate and certify airline staff in cultural competency, unconscious bias, and dignified service standards, with an emphasis on systemic equity across customer experience departments. The proposal was bold, expansive, and deeply personal. Jamal believed that transformation didn't come from punishing individuals alone. It came from redesigning the systems that made discriminatory behavior seem acceptable in the first place. To his surprise, Aerosky agreed, not only pledging funding, but also implementing the program as a mandatory part of staff training. Other carriers took notice. Within 12 months, First Class for All expanded into 6 major airlines across the country, gaining traction as a new gold standard in hospitality ethics. At the heart of this effort was an unlikely figure, Kayla, the once junior flight attendant who had followed bad instructions on Flight 561 and remained silent when she could have spoken up, submitted a handwritten letter of apology to Jamal a week after the incident. In it, she admitted her complicity, expressed deep regret, and asked if there was any way she could be part of the solution rather than just another symbol of the problem. Jamal, after reading her letter twice, chose grace. He invited her to enroll in the pilot version of the training program. To her credit, she didn't just attend, she excelled. Over the following year, Kayla transitioned from student to mentor and eventually became one of the lead peer educators within the First Class for All initiative. Her journey wasn't framed as redemption for public consumption, but rather as internal repair, a commitment to do better when it mattered most. Jamal never made her the face of the campaign. That wasn't the point. The program wasn't about performance, it was about process, culture, and accountability. Ronald Blake, now a vocal supporter of the initiative, publicly credited Jamal's quiet leadership and systems-based approach for shifting the airline's internal culture in a way that no memo or PR statement ever could. For Jamal, the most rewarding moments weren't the applause or recognition. They came in quiet emails from crew members who wrote to say they'd seen things differently since the training, or in stories from young black passengers who no longer felt out of place in first class. Those were the metrics that mattered. Not headlines, not settlements, but change. Slow, steady, systemic change. And it all began not with confrontation, but with composure, clarity, and the decision to turn exclusion into education. 3 months later, at the International Aviation Leadership Summit in Dallas, Jamal Carter took the stage to a standing ovation. Dressed in a sharp navy suit and framed by a backdrop bearing the words, "Equity in Elevation," he stood before an audience of industry executives, policymakers, and frontline service workers who had followed the aftermath of Flight 561 with intense interest. His voice was steady, deliberate. "I didn't come here for champagne," he began, pausing just long enough for the room to settle. "I came for respect. You don't build excellence by lowering others. When you serve, serve with clear eyes and an open heart, because sometimes a small gesture can expose a system, and a single moment can ignite reform." The room was silent, not out of discomfort, but in deep reflection. Jamal wasn't preaching, he was revealing. The impact of his experience had rippled through the airline industry and beyond, becoming a case study in how leadership responds to discrimination. Not with reactive apologies, but with structural accountability. The First Class for All initiative he launched had become a benchmark, prompting conversations in industries ranging from hospitality to healthcare. But for Jamal, the work wasn't about headlines. It was about culture, the kind that endures beyond crises. Discrimination doesn't always arrive with loud slurs or overt actions. Often, it shows up in glances that slide past you, in service that never arrives, in voices that falter when addressing your presence. It hides in policies that appear neutral but are practiced with bias. True change begins when we stop excusing these moments as harmless or accidental and start calling them what they are. Signals of a deeper inequality baked into routine. Respect isn't situational, it's systemic. And for those in positions of influence, silence is never neutral. It reinforces the status quo. You don't have to be angry to be powerful, and you don't have to be loud to be heard. Real authority doesn't show up with volume. It shows up in how you use your platform to correct what's broken. Jamal's response wasn't to shame or retaliate, but to convert harm into education, exclusion into transformation. That's where leadership lives, in the choice to turn a personal slight into a public standard. And in doing so, he reminded an entire industry that leadership is not about asserting dominance. It's about modeling dignity. One denied champagne glass may seem trivial, but in the right hands, it can become a lever for massive institutional reform. Because sometimes the smallest slights contain the clearest truths. And when those truths are met with courage instead of silence, systems change. Slowly, purposefully, permanently. If this story moved you, made you think twice about how dignity and respect should never be optional, then don't let it end here. At X Daily Stories, we bring you real, powerful, and thought-provoking narratives that reveal the unseen, challenge the norms, and celebrate voices that refuse to be silenced. Subscribe now to join a growing community that believes in justice, humanity, and the power of storytelling to spark change. And drop a comment below, because your voice matters too. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the smallest act of resistance can rewrite the rules for everyone.